all draw as kids, but I learned to draw as an adult, aged 37. And if I were to ask you about drawing, I'm pretty sure that most of you would say, oh no, Bryan, I can't draw. As if it was some sort of binary talent that some of us have and some of us haven't. And it feels like a fact, but actually it's just a story. It's a story that somehow has been pinned on us. And maybe like many of you, I decided at some point in my youth that I couldn't draw. And I could tell you the story of me and a friend in primary school, and we were drawing airplanes, and how some other kids said they liked his airplane better than mine. And maybe that was just one step towards a self-imposed negative conclusion. But fast forward to 10 years ago, and I had just sold a business to a much larger business, and they worked very differently from my small business. It was meetings 9 to 5, and I was on the leadership team. And I was really struggling to get my ideas across. And at the same time, a colleague there showed me that you could use a stylus to draw on an iPad. And an iPad's a very forgiving way to draw. You can just undo if it doesn't quite work out. But I thought to myself, I've always been an experimenter. I thought, how can I use this? Maybe I can do some scribbling to help get some of my thoughts across. And a strange thing happened, because I found that my drawings hung around. When you're in a meeting, the things you say sort of disappear into the ether. But whenever you create something like a drawing, it hangs around. And my drawings ended up in meetings that I wasn't part of. And they ended up in presentations that I didn't give. But more surprisingly, no one ever told me to stop. When someone asks me, what do you do for a living, Bryan? There's a very awkward moment where I fumble about for words to describe a job I've completely made up. You see, I listen to conversations, which I record, and then I go back through the conversations and harvest them for visual ideas. Because I have found that when people talk openly, when they talk about something they care about, and they talk from the heart, that naturally little bits of humour, both dark and light humour, bubble up in the stories that they tell. And they reach for metaphors that add colour to the picture that they're trying to paint. And these metaphors and this humour, well, to me, they are clues to the puzzle. They are visual signposts. They're like seeds just waiting to be nurtured and developed into life, brought to life. You see, people tell stories, and stories paint pictures. And if you're able to tune in to those stories, you can start to see the world that begins to appear. Now then, when I tune in to a conversation that I'm facilitating, sometimes an idea will present itself. And it will stand tall and true, and it'll say, here I am the idea that you've been looking for. But I have found that the most interesting ideas, the strongest ideas, are tucked away in the undergrowth. They're they're just waiting to be noticed, and they just sort of catch your eye. And when I'm facilitating a conversation, quite often, I'm always trying to bring out the quiet voice. The voice that, for whatever reason, isn't grabbing the mic. And often I'll hear this phrase that goes, "Oh, this is probably a silly idea, but," and I find that that's where the gold lies. And so I listen. So first I listen, and then I draw my listen. And listening, it's different because you're listening with a pen in your hand. And you get quite addicted to it once you get the hang of it. I was working on a project with a guy from Dublin. He was writing a paper on colonialism and the Irish language. And I was doing what I do. I was tuning into what he was saying. And our conversation strayed to our experience of Irish history in the education that we had received. He from the south and I from the north. And I remember him saying to me, he said, by the time we were finished at school, we were sick to the back teeth of Irish history. It was so bleak. Bleak? I don't remember it being bleak. And we compared notes. I realized that, of course, I had been given the British version of Irish history, which doesn't actually have that much Irish history in it. A short time after, I was speaking at an event in Athlone, and a super bunch of educators, all volunteers, had invited me over to speak. And we were in the pub the day before, or the evening before, and I found myself saying the phrase, "the Irish potato famine." And one of them nudged me and says, here we just call it the famine. And I thought to myself, that's strange. How come I know the date of the Great Fire of London and the date of the Battle of the Boyne, but I'm not quite sure when the famine, or the Great Famine happened, and Gorta Moor. And then I realized that it's because it's not my famine. It's not my story. My uncle was a potato farmer. I picked potatoes every summer. My dad's first job was working for the Department of Agriculture, checking the light levels on potato fields. But we never talked about the famine. There were no stories. There were no voices. There were no songs. We didn't talk about it at church. There was nothing. So how can that be? How can it be that one of the single most cataclysmic events to happen in this island, and it's completely missing from me? What pen drew the lines that separate us? Who built the walls that stop our stories? I was traveling on a train from Glasgow to London. And after finding a seat with enough legroom, it's a constant problem, I was sitting across from this guy and who had already had his cans of lager on the table. And we didn't say anything to each other to begin with. And I was looking out the window and I was doing some writing and he was reading the paper. And then I made a silly comment about his consumption of back-to-back Scotch pies. And we both laughed, and a conversation started. And he offered me a beer. And he was English. But he had Irish or Northern Irish heritage. And he went back quite a bit. He loved Northern Ireland. And so, me being from there, we had lots to talk about. And after a while, he told me that he was an ex-soldier. And I thought I hadn't really talked to an ex-soldier before. I'm from farming stock, so, I've certainly never had a decent conversation with one. And he told me that after leaving the army, how he had struggled with mental health and how he'd managed to get back on his feet again and get some work. And I listened to him. And I told him about that even though, I was brought up in a teetotal Protestant community, that I've been slowly becoming more and more Irish. And I told him about the fact that I've discovered this missing history. I told him about the famine, that 1 million people died and 2 million people displaced. The absentee landlords, the evictions, and the food exports going up in famine years. And he listened to me. And he said he didn't know anything about that. And we parted as friends whenever he got off the train, having seen just a glimpse from each other's perspective. What does it take to listen to somebody else's story? Is it a safe space? A neutral territory? Some common ground, maybe? I've realized that you can't tell anybody anything, but everybody needs to be heard. And dialogue starts with listening. We need to listen to stories, old stories and new stories, stories from a different province, funny stories, personal stories, inherited stories, disinherited stories, difficult, hard to hear stories, fearful stories, sorrowful stories. Because I believe that stories have the power to stitch us back together again. Not because of a set of true facts, but because they sow a connection from a speaking voice to a listening ear, to form a patchwork landscape of experience. But there's a choice here. Because to absorb someone's story comes at a cost. So do you stay in your bubble with your knowledge of how the world is and how people are? Or do you step out into the unknown, ready to listen? The stories are already there. You've just got to find them. Thank you.